I'm going to get things kicked off. Hopefully we'll get a few more joiners coming in. So good day to everyone and welcome to Better Governance Strategies Across Asia's Digital Divide, 100 Governance Questions Initiatives. I'm Anthea Mulakala. I'm the Director for International Development Cooperation at the Asia Foundation. And I'm going to be your moderator today as we discuss some of these very important questions on how data-driven governance, how data-driven governance practices can help tackle some of the most pressing challenges in Asia. To start, I'd like to introduce Nicola Nixon, the Asia Foundation's Governance Director, who has been spearheading this program from our side. Nicola will give us an overview of the 100 Questions Initiative and explain the very important voting process. So I'll turn it over to Nicola.
Thanks very much, Anthea. Just bear with me for a moment. I'll just share my screen. All right, can I get a thumbs up that you can see that nicely and clearly? Fantastic. Okay, so thanks, Anthea. It's lovely to be here today. So, as Anthea mentioned, I've been spearheading, my governance team has been spearheading this 100 Questions Governance Domain Initiative, together with our partners from the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development, the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Indonesia, and GovLab in New York. Now, before we go into the panel discussion today, I wanted to make sure that you're all familiar with this initiative, give you a little bit of background on this 100 governance questions for those of you who aren't already familiar with it. So it's part of a broader initiative that's instigated and designed by GovLab in New York, which is the broader initiative itself is 100 questions. And to date, GovLab has collaborated with a very wide range of actors, international and local organisations, on 6 other domains, including gender, migration, and the future of work. And so if you haven't explored all of these and you haven't come into contact with them before, I'd encourage you to check them out on the GovLab website. But for today, we're focused in on the work that we've been doing specifically under the governance domain. Now, governance is an overarching theme of our work in the Asia Foundation. So in early 2021, we built this partnership with GovLab, BIGD and CSIS to pursue the setting of a governance agenda for data and development. Just move on my slide. There we go. Okay, so what does this initiative seek to address? So, and I'm not telling you anything that you don't know already, but we live in an era marked by an unprecedented amount of data. Anyone who uses a mobile phone or accesses the internet is generating vast streams of information. And COVID-19 has only intensified this phenomenon. So although this data contains tremendous potential for positive social transformation, much of that potential goes unfulfilled. In the development context, one chief problem is that data initiatives are often driven by supply, i.e. what data or data solutions are available, rather than demand, what are the problems that actually need to be solved. Too many projects begin with the database, the app, the dashboard, beholden, we would argue, to the seduction of technology. And now many parts of the world, we would also argue, of the developing world, are graveyards of tech pilots. So the 100 Questions Initiative seeks to make a contribution to overcoming the chasm between supply and demand for data. It begins not by searching for what data is available, but asking more important questions about the biggest challenges that societies and countries face, and then seeking more targeted and relevant data solutions. And in doing this, it narrows the gap between policymakers and constituents, providing opportunities for improved evidence-based policy and community engagement in developing countries. So we posed this question that you see on the slide. What are the 10 most important questions in governance that data can be harnessed to answer? In order to do this, we've been following this 6-step process for crowdsourcing these questions under the methodology developed by GovLab. And this slide, the 6 steps that you can see, indicates how far we've gone. We've specified the domain partners, and that's the 4 organisations I spoke of just a moment ago. And we created a bilingual community. I'll go into this in a moment. In this first 4 steps, and we've still got 2 steps to go. So this second step was quite a significant one, and together with BIGD and CSIS and GovLab, we identified and onboarded 131 bilinguals. And bilinguals in the 100 Questions Initiative methodology are experts or people who speak data research or data science and governance. So in a way, they speak both languages. We tried to make this as diverse a group as possible, and as you can see, we were reasonably successful in this endeavour. 1/3 of our 131 governance bilinguals are from government, around 1/5 are non-profit organisations, around 1/5 for multilaterals, 10% from business, some academia and think tanks. And we also aimed for a fairly dispersed geography, and you can see here as well that we do have representatives from all major regions globally. So the bilinguals were then asked to generate the questions, to tell us what are the questions that they were asking themselves, what are the really important questions in the work that they're doing, and also provide a rationale for those questions. And we started with over 170. So we took those 170 questions, and through 2 rounds of clustering, removing duplication and linking different questions together, and we went through another prioritisation round together with the bilinguals, who voted on those questions to narrow it down to the 10 that we now find ourselves with. And that, I have to say, took quite some months. It was a big collaborative process with large documents with complicated questions in them, and back and forth from many of the bilinguals to clarify and further refine their questions. And that got us to this. What you can see here is a shortened version of the 10 questions. I don't expect you to read this all of them. It's just to indicate that these are the sorts of topics that you're not going to be surprised to see on this list, where we have things like transparency and public trust, access to data, the impact of social media, civic engagement, the impact of open governance and open governance initiatives, inclusion, social accountability, democratic regression. They're all themes that I'm sure would be very familiar to all of you. So this is the stage that we're at, and this is why we're having these webinars, to encourage as many people to vote as possible. So we're now crowdsourcing votes on these top 10 questions to find out which ones are the most important to you. So we'll show you this again, and the questions will be available throughout the discussion, the panel discussion today. And in the meantime, we'll be encouraging you to go to the website and vote during the session. There are 2 more stages once we've crowdsourced views on these 10 questions that we currently have, and I'll explain those in a little bit more detail at the end of today's session. But for now, I'm going to hand back to Anthea to introduce our fantastic panelists for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola. So just before we kick off with the discussion, I've got some brief housekeeping issues to cover. So first, our event today is 90 minutes long and will be recorded for post-event release. We want you to vote, so you may wish to have the voting page open. I believe Miranda shared the link in the chat. Have it open. It'll also be an easy reference to the questions. There will be time for audience questions after our panel discussion, so please post your questions in the Q&A box, and you can do that throughout the session. And also, we are live transcribing this event, which is a very cool function, which we just discovered. And you can click on, if you see the menu on Zoom along the bottom, you'll see it says CC transcription or CC transcribe. And if you click on that, it gives you a number of options, either to have kind of subtitles or to have the transcript running along the side. So it's a great function, and hopefully will make the discussion today much more accessible to everyone. Right, so now on to our panel discussion. I am delighted to welcome our expert panel, all of whom, as Nicola said, have been engaged in the project as bilinguals, so formulating and prioritizing the questions. And today, what we're going to do is dive deeper into some of the challenges that inform these questions and make them difficult to answer. So to do that, I'm joined by Shreya Basu, who is Deputy Director of Open Government Partnership in Singapore, Shreya has been supporting diverse organizations and governments across Asia on open governance, transparency, including aid transparency, and citizen participation. Next, we have Priyank Hirani, who is the Asia Regional Data and Technology Lead with the Rockefeller Foundation. Priyank's work has focused on bringing the benefits of technology from the private sector to CSOs and governments, including through initiatives like AI for social good and data for development. We also have Nazrina Badiri, who is Country Director for Innovation for Poverty Action in the Philippines. And Nazrina brings experience from government, academia, and NGOs, particularly from the Philippines, where she's a recognized social change leader in education, financial inclusion, and social protection. And finally, we have Afreen Siddiqui, who is the Asia Regional Engagement Lead on Government Innovation with United Nations Development Program. And Afreen brings diverse experience working with the Indian government, UN agencies, and the private sector. And she's currently leading UNDP's flagship program, Next Gen Gov, which addresses post-COVID future of governance and policy innovations. So if you have had a chance to read our policy bios, or if you get a chance to look at them later, you will see that all our panelists are highly decorated, awarded, and recognized as global leaders and advocates in this space. So really anxious to hear your views. So let's kick off. We've got a series of questions to go through, and our panelists know that they have to be brief, and we hope to have a good discussion going, and there will be questions and answers from the audience after. So my first question is for Shreya and Priyank. So the 100 questions sought to capture the most pressing questions across a range of countries and regions. So from the 10 questions that have been prioritized, what are some of the themes that resonate most in Asia and why? So Shreya, you've been working with local governments and parliaments across the region. Do these questions strike a familiar chord with these groups?
Great, thanks for that question, Anthea. And let me start off by congratulating the Asia Foundation and partners at the 100 Questions Initiative for winnowing down 170 questions to these 10. It was great for some of us in the OGP community to be part of the bilinguals group. And we're really excited to see what comes out of this next, including the data collaboratives you talked about. And your question is a hard one, Anthea. It's really hard to pick because they're all good questions. As an open government advocate and someone interested in the research side of things, I think many of us would be interested in seeing all of them answered, if possible. But perhaps no surprises given our work in the Open Government Partnership. The ones around the impact of open government initiatives really resonate. I think this is a challenging time for those advocating for open government in the region, whether you're on the inside, in the parliaments or the local governments or at national governments when you're reformers, or if you're activists trying to push for change from the outside. We know civic liberties have been on the decline. We're seeing a comeback of identity politics, along different identity lines, even in the more open and democratic societies within this region, relatively speaking, of course, becoming much more sort of, salient as a ballot box issue than issues of effective governance or issues of open governance. And there are only a handful of countries in the Asia-Pacific region that are even eligible to be part of the Open Government Partnership. So they fall well short of the criteria of having some basic fundamental policies in place to be able to even join a voluntary initiative of this nature. And what we've also seen, I think, in recent years is that the political, social, and economic cracks that have emerged in the Western liberal democracies being cited as examples by leaders in this region as reasons or excuses rather for not pursuing similar paths, right? So I think these questions that touch upon the impact of open governance initiatives, of social accountability, of open budget data are important and need answering to either equip ourselves with powerful examples of transformative results when we counter these arguments, or with that spirit of humility to rethink the substance, the design, the implementation of these initiatives if it turns out that the evidence is not in favor. I do think that we have to be a bit careful as we try to attempt these questions because we know already from our experience at OGP that many open government initiatives as they stand today are designed poorly, not credibly implemented, and do not take into account local needs and contexts in place. So I think we need to be a bit careful about drawing simplistic conclusions that we might learn from this kind of research, so that we don't see that research being, feed right into the hands of people who are trying to close civic space, because we know we also get better outcomes when there is meaningful civic engagement within open government initiatives. I think similarly questions around effective civic engagement at the national and local levels and the question of incentives I find really exciting, and both because there's such richness of experience in this region, including some of the work that TAF has been doing across countries in this region. But also, if you look at the RTI movement in India, very much a grassroots-led movement with, citizens really demanding to know how they could access their entitlements. Some of the most amazing examples of community-based monitoring and participation in public service decision-making, public service delivery decision-making in Philippines, Indonesia, Mongolia, or, even the people power movements you've seen more recently in South Korea and going back a few decades in places like Indonesia and the Philippines, right? So I think this region has a lot of richness of experience to offer in answering those questions. But also because, going forward, it's important to understand the incentives and skills portion of those questions of citizens, because very often, I think, as Nicola mentioned, we see a lot of these initiatives being designed, citizen participation opportunities being designed without actually taking into account their needs, their skills, their incentives to participate in mind. So, as we move forward, I think it'll be important for us to understand these. And then finally, I think the questions around inclusion definitely resonate, just because of the diversity you see both within countries in this region and of course between countries in the region. And I think my fear is that a lot of work we are seeing around gender and inclusion in this region tends to stay at the level of performative, at the level of box ticking exercises, not really shifting power dynamics in any kind of meaningful way. So as the language of inclusion gains currency, which is a positive development that we should welcome, I hope that we can also look at what meaningful inclusion initiatives look like, so that development dollars are not being wasted on tick box exercises on inclusion as we move forward. I'll stop there. Like I said, they're all interesting questions. They all have some resonance or the other in the region.
Thanks so much. Just really struck me when you talked about inclusion and your earlier point about that so many countries in the region aren't actually eligible to participate in similar initiatives or in some of the initiatives that come out of your organization. So that's really lends to a certain accessibility issue. Priyank, I just wanted to turn to you now and say, how does this look from your perch, from where you stand?
Thanks, Anthea, for the question, and thank you so much to the Asia Foundation and the group for inviting me. Really great to be here. I think it's very difficult to follow on after Shreya. She's covered everything I wanted to say, so I don't have really much to add. But as Shreya said, right, I resonate with what she said in terms of all the questions are very interesting, and they're really pertinent to the times we live in, right? So the three themes that resonated most with me from the perspective for the Asia region were around sort of ensuring how do we ensure transparency and accountability, because that in my head then leads to public trust, and that then looks at how do we uphold democratic norms, right? So which then can be linked to better public service delivery. And this chain of thought then helps us answer some of those questions through data. The second point that was something that also Shreya mentioned was the idea of inclusion, right? So I look at inclusion from two perspectives. One, in terms of sort of whose data is available and how do we make sure that underrepresented groups whose data is not available do get into being counted. And then in a meaningful way, how do we get people voices at the decision-making table, right? So it's both from the perspective of getting data for those set of groups, as well as then making the voice count. And then that leading to ensuring proper resource allocation or proper well-being as the data then would be able to give us some insights into it. And a third point, and I'll keep this brief, would be around sort of factors affecting effective civic engagement, as again something that Shreya mentioned. For me, that is important from the point of view of sort of what skills are important, how do we ensure the right skills for people to be able to participate in decision making forums. How do we ensure that they have access to both the information as well as the capability to engage in a meaningful dialogue, as well as what are the incentives in looking at some of these issues. So I think all those three points resonated most with me, and from where I stand, I feel like regions in Asia countries in Asia do have quite a bit of value to add globally in terms of looking at how can data reflect on the governance questions. Thanks, Anthea.
Yeah, thanks so much, Priyank. I think your last point leads really well into our next question about, the digital divide. So even before COVID, alarms were sounding around the increasing digital divide, across the region, Asia and the Pacific. But since the pandemic, the divide has become even more stark, with so many basic services being shifted online and often quite difficult to navigate. So Nazrina and Afreen, this question is for you. Please share with us how this looks from your perspective and what's happening to narrow the gap. So Nazrina, I'll start with you. What does this look like in the Philippines?
Thank you, Anthea. That's a very important question, especially at this time. And with the start of the pandemic, we've seen how technology was leveraged in many different sectors, but we've also seen its devastating effects, right? Especially being felt in our nation's economy and many sectors, which would have long-term implications, as all of us already know. More than ever, accurate, reliable, and timely data is needed, given increasingly limited fiscal space and other resource constraints. The pandemic also highlighted the need for equal access to government programs and services. In the Philippines, I think one of the major issues has really been improving learning outcomes, specifically for many public schools in the country. 90% of public schools in the Philippines use printed modular distance learning, with only those in highly urbanized areas using online distance learning. Right? IPA ran several studies in mid-2020 where poorer households cited lack of internet access, lack of devices, and other learning resources as the major barriers that students face. At the same time, in-person classes have been suspended in the Philippines since March 2020, which would have far-reaching implications in student learning. And so, we've been working with government to understand and explore initiatives to bridge these potential learning losses. And there has been a recognition that challenges does exist in delivering these learning modalities, specifically during this time of the pandemic, to more than 27 million students in the Philippines. With these various challenges in distance learning, we see also unequal access to education support at home, stemming learning loss, particularly in areas where learning resources are lacking in the household. And this requires innovative strategies that can reach as many families as possible. And so at this time, it's really important to generate evidence on what's working and what's not working. This has been a long-standing question, even prior to the pandemic, but even more important now. Important as well to draw lessons from other countries who also are facing similar issues, and at the same time understanding whether new interventions to address learning gaps can work in the Philippine context. So, for example, high-tech solutions such as online learning, which work in many countries as well, may not specifically work for many parts of the Philippines, given these digital divide and infrastructure issues. And so recently, Innovations for Poverty Action launched a study with our partners, Young Love and the Department of Education in the Philippines, to understand the impact of low-tech education interventions, just using mobile phones instead of computers to improve learning outcomes, to encourage student engagement and parent engagement, right? So teachers just call, the students at home using their mobile numbers and deliver some sort of tutoring through the phone and make sure that they're engaged. So these kinds of interventions, like, trying to leverage more the low-tech side rather than the high-tech side, help us try to address that digital divide, which I think has been successful in other countries, and we would like to test this in the Philippines because we don't have enough data and evidence to say that this would actually work. And so that's actually ongoing at the moment.
Yeah, I really hear you. I mean, education, I think, is one sector that across the region has been so fundamentally affected by COVID, and almost every family has been impacted. And definitely, if there's anything that we've learned, is that the importance of low-tech accessible technology. So really thank you for emphasizing that point. Afreen, would love to hear from you on how I'm sure UNDP is trying to tackle these issues across the region. Yeah, I'd love to hear from you on that.
Thank you so much, Anthea, and it's indeed a very the need of the hour, literally to press the pressing challenges that the governments are facing. That's what's being tackled with the 100 governance questions, which I'm hoping that do not just limit themselves to the questions, but we also navigate further, with solutions together to help the governments across the region. But then, yes, digital divide is like the most popular word that I have heard, at least in the last 1 year of my career. Have never heard that ever. Although I did work with the government in India and then with UNDP in India. All those words of e-governance and digital skills, digital literacy used to be really attractive, in the early 2000s, but then now they've like become not attractive, but essential. So if you see the position of chief digital officers in the private sector has strengthened more. There's more payout to people in digital. At the same time, if you look at the governments, what we as UNDP have found and interacting with, both political as well as bureaucratic fraternity of the region, we feel that, Asia is one of the most challenging regions across the globe when it comes to, this challenge of digital divide. We are actually having more than 52% of our population actually offline. It's really a critical thing to address, this high level, which accounts to over 4.3 billion people of the world, right? So we are, a world in ourselves, which has, like India, of course, as one of the largest countries, the largest populations. And all these people who are offline, so be it public service delivery system for maybe, children who have actually moved, this mode of offline come online education, or be it, senior citizens who are really keen to get access to health services who are unable to access telehealth or digital health facilities. So what I feel is, digital divide is a challenge. And what we have also learned from the governments is, it's not an infrastructural challenge alone. It's a functional challenge too. So while one part of it is infrastructure, so, people may be having smartphones, may not be having smartphones, may be having access to laptops or, community laptops. In India, there's this concept of community laptops. There's a village, and then there's a certain population of children being given slots to access a particular laptop in the village panchayat office. So it's all very, the efforts are really going there. But then at the same time, that it is equally a functional challenge. So you make sure you get, physical infrastructural support using private sector, public-private partnerships, using philanthropies. And, so many philanthropic organizations have put their hands together to, help bridge the digital divide. And as UNDP, what we have seen and what we have worked together with the government is also to identify these structural challenges that the governments are, unable to, or maybe partially able to address. So imagine, if you're not able to really, make sure that the learning is passing on to the children online with quality. What's the point in having a smartphone in front of your eyes when your teachers are not really smart, in handling the digital? And it's all new for everyone. So it is a fundamental challenge. We've seen, Bangladesh government together with A2I, which is a lab, innovation lab. It began as an innovation lab and now is like a digital mission in the Prime Minister's office of Bangladesh, that they begin with smartphones and then they realized that that's not working. They actually started using television, using the parliamentary television to impart, education. And then they realized there needs to be like training for the teachers. So there are so many elements of digital divide, both infrastructural and functional, that needs to be addressed. And I think as a region, Asia is tackling it better than the globe, I feel, because, necessity is the mother of invention. I feel that this is the region which needs the most support, because not just of the population, but also the kind of human resource support that, that's needed to back the public service delivery system with quality and quantity at the same time. So I'd end there by saying that definitely digital divide is a challenge, definitely a challenge in Asia. But then all of us, be the civil society, UN agencies, philanthropies, are actually, joining forces to address it piece by piece. Together, maybe giving a platform approach to it, and it's the need of the hour, I feel. Yeah. Oh, back to you, Anthea.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's so important that there's so many stakeholders that need to be involved, right? It is about governments, it's about private sector, it's about multilaterals and civil society. I mean, it's multidimensional. I just wanted to offer, we're doing well on time. So Shreya or Priyank, did you want to hop on this question at all and add any comments?
Priyank, do you want to go first?
Yeah, no, I was going to say that, no, it's well covered. I just wanted to pick on the last point on ensuring sort of the multidimensionality of the problems, and then also involving sort of taking a systems approach, and therefore ensuring sort of all stakeholders, all relevant stakeholders are part of the solution stage also. That's something that sort of even with the partnership that Rockefeller and UNDP have at the regional level, we've been trying to do in different countries, including Philippines and India. And I'm sure Afreen will talk about it in a later stage, but that's something that we have seen has been able to show some initial positive results. And I think that model could be a good way forward.
Freya.
Yeah, and I think the only thing that again, looking at what we've seen in OGP, I mean, whatever digital solutions or techno solutions that might be, being offered or experimented with as we move along, the need to combine offline mechanisms with anything that's online, even where divides don't exist, even in well-connected or well-capacitated sort of locations, I think that has always proven to be of paramount importance. The ability to be able to actually sit down face-to-face when conditions once again allow for that, hopefully in a post-pandemic world, to really try and get to the root cause of problems, to try and understand how compromises can be reached in finding solutions. The importance of all of that still remains, even as we need digital to deliver a lot more, given the restrictions that the pandemic has laid bare for us. So I think that importance of the things that are sort of analog to be combined with digital, remains important, as we've seen in OGP. The best of digital innovations don't work when you do not create the spaces for dialogue and collaboration that exist both online and offline.
So just a quick follow-up to this. I mean, you've all expressed the needs, how we need to do this, what should happen, this kind of technology, this kind of stakeholders. Have you got any quick examples of somewhere where this is really working, or a kind of innovation that is bridging the divide in any situations that you can shout out? Oh no.
It's like when you say it's really working, that's like a challenge, right? Whether you can say that, because if you say that, then there are like 100 more questions coming out of that. But anyways, I think it is definitely working, and across the region, countries, the governments are trying to navigate their ways. For example, what GovTech is doing in Singapore with their app of participatory governance, with Singapore going in the in the high and low on the graph of COVID-19 situation, and the way they tackled their citizen engagement, and the way they communicated with their citizens, and the citizens fed their data responsibly on the system. India actually learned a lot from the Singapore model, and then they had their Arogya Setu app with billions of downloads. So India is India, right? So it's like it's an example in itself. It is. I think these apps that actually started with those COVID-19 intimations actually gave rise to a lot of other apps or dealing with health services. So there's something called as Diksha, which is a platform on education in India. They realized that after COVID-19 and going on online mode of learning, they could actually capture the data of how effectively the teachers are able to deliver their lessons using this platform in the app. Or they also could capture the need assessment of, where exactly teachers need more support on trainings. So definitely, I think, these are, few pieces that I feel that are innovation in their own, and they have worked. But obviously, nothing is like perfect, and it's all experimental governance around COVID. So we really had like high scale experiments going on. Initially, we always saw that the governments are so reluctant in experimenting. They would never want to invest taxpayers' money on anything which is experiment. But COVID-19, relief and rehabilitation literally was a very large experiment that all of us witnessed, and the government was willing to take all kind of challenges. So I feel that, yeah, these are little innovations that have worked. The apps converted to platforms, and platform converting, giving real-time data and information to help improve public service delivery systems qualitatively as well as quantitatively.
Yeah, that's a great example, sort of innovation by necessity, right? It drove us to multi-purpose different kinds of apps and look at multiple applications. Yeah, great example. So that does lead well into our next question. I mean, surely governments across the region are keen to make data work for them. However, there's often a big gulf, as we've discussed, between desire and capability. So again, I want to talk to Afrin and Shreya here. Can you share any experiences where you've seen governments are more willing to increase their use of data to inform policy responses? Like, how did this work, and what did it take to translate that will into action? Shreya, why don't you start?
Sure. I mean, it's again a difficult question because, governments are not monolithic, right? Within the same government, you find, a serious resistance towards use of data or any kind of evidence-based policymaking, and others where, they're trying really disruptive things. Two examples, I think one I'll give from South Cotabato, an OGP local member from the Philippines, where they really opened up their procurement data, across the sort of procurement cycle, and started using that data to make decisions around, underperforming contracts, monitoring in real time some of the high stakes, service delivery projects. And again, it's not necessarily the fanciest or the shiniest platform out there, but what we have seen is a willingness to use procurement data that's being, released by the government to look at where inefficiencies need to be addressed, but also really giving that data in the hands of citizens to be able to report back irregularities, delays, where they might witness leakages to, inform their own supervision of it. And in terms of the kinds of actors and approaches, obviously, I think the South Cotabato example is a powerful one of what you get when you have collaboration between the private sector, civil society, government, both political leadership, but also the bureaucracy, as well as technical partners like HIVOS and, the European Chamber of Commerce is involved there as well. And going to the approaches, I think, I've been working on the margins of the open data movement for, almost 10 years now. And what it takes hasn't changed fundamentally over the last decade. It's just surprising that you don't see more of this, right? User-centered design, again, combining offline and online mechanisms, creating space for dialogue so that, the data that you collect, the data that you publish is actually serving, real needs. But also the ways in which it's being used to improve data quality, the way it's being used to improve decision-making. So South Cotabato has these integrity circles, for example, where they bring together all these actors in a regular dialogue to look at the results of what they're doing through this, data publication around open contracting, but also where the gaps continue to remain, where, advocacy needs still, surface for civil society to take outside of those channels and, try and sort of enable change both at the national as well as the local level. But also for businesses to be able to bring to the discussions their needs, because I think often we see a pitting of different sectors against each other in a way that's very unhealthy. So I think the approaches, again, sound really intuitive, but surprisingly still haven't quite caught on with the number of open data initiatives that we see across many countries. The second one, I don't think we've seen the results of it quite yet, but I like the ambition of it. I'm talking about the open map policy in Indonesia, where there was a decision to have an interagency effort to try and have one single map of Indonesia to be able to identify contesting claims over land, but also sort of looking to use that data to inform future licensing issues. And while we still don't have a good results story to tell out of it, it's still very much a very long, drawn, lengthy process of getting there. It's led to some very interesting public discussion around customary lands, data custodianship, who gets to define, who gets to supply data. And I think that in itself is a worthwhile exercise. So that's another one that I really hope that it doesn't take as long as it has so far, to see some more traction, and that the public discourse on this really leads to both official data being married with customary data that is held by people that have been living in these communities for a very long time. And I think if that example works, it will be a very powerful one, for land reform in a number of different countries in the region. So that one I'm really excited by. And the last one, but I think this is perhaps an obvious one, Seoul in South Korea. I think we've seen some fantastic use of data to inform everything from public transportation routes to allocation of budgets to how performance venues need to be designed or redesigned. And again, there I think the very strong, of course, investments in technology, early investments, but also the leadership from the top has been crucial in ensuring the success of those initiatives. So I'm also excited to hear what Afreen has to say, because I know they've been trying a lot of really cool, interesting things in recent years.
Yeah, those are great examples. I wasn't surprised when you started with the Philippines. I thought, I could imagine something like that. It's got such a participatory kind of culture and political culture anyway, but really interesting about the other two. But Afreen, I hope you have some examples from South Asia that you can share.
Oh my God. I've been put on a spot here because I also wanted to start with Philippines. Because yes, of course, sometimes there are champion governments, and I really believe in this concept. Over a period of last 1 decade of my my professional service in this region, I can tell you for sure that there are certain champion governments who really back up policy. So there's always a very heavy challenge when it comes to bridging the bureaucratic and the political will together. So it is a challenge, and it is I'm sure all of us are like governance practitioners, so we know that what the bureaucracy speaks and what the political will speaks, like, not the same language. So in these set of countries, so be it Indonesia, be it India, Philippines, to some extent Malaysia, sorry, I'm just naming these countries because of the maybe I may be missing out Vietnam. So these are countries who have really decided to back their policies on evidence-based policy making. So data is the heart of their policies, irrespective of whatever the political challenges be in the country. Most of the governments are not really open to open their data. Shreya obviously is living that fact. But when it comes to us, what we've tried to do is tried our diplomatic ways to open up the governments in their innovative and our innovative ways. And there's an incentive as well, right? So in Philippines, we actually started working with the government, beginning with the Department of Health, something called as Pintig Lab, which actually is it just got born out of COVID. So there's like a lot of data coming in during COVID, and the government wanted to make sure they are able to capture the data. So they partnered with UNDP, and now we have like a live innovation lab, like Pintig Lab is a live data lab that the government and UNDP are together set up. Most of the departments have started to collaborate, and it actually gives real-time data to feed into policy. So we've just released a report on vaccine hesitancy. So like gone are the days where you're like literally still collecting the data and still thinking about analyzing it, and then still thinking about documenting a reform in a policy for a cabinet approval, and then it has all those set of approvals. So they're like gone. So specifically when it comes to these labs that have been set up in the region, there's real-time decision making using real-time data. It is rare, but it is happening. So that's like one example from Philippines that really showed how the Department of Health actually managed to really win the vaccine hesitancy challenge. And with thanks to Rockefeller Foundation for supporting that initiative on data-driven policy making. So we're actually setting up a data for policy platform shortly with the support from Rockefeller Foundation, where we're actually trying to onboard such champion governments. So I began saying champion governments, but I really want to share that they like champion governments is equal to champion policymakers. So policymakers who are really willing to take up that risk, that no worries, I will, take up this risk. I will open up the data. Let's do some pilot around and then I'll make sure that I'll do the lobbying that is needed at my government level to scale this kind of approach up. So I think we've started doing this with India, with Philippines, with Indonesia, with Thailand, with Laos, where UNDP has partnered with governments at the national level on digital transformation and data-driven policy making. Second example I'd like to actually give is, is immediately from, I think I've spoken a lot about India already, but I can actually speak about Indonesia. With the government in Indonesia, I don't know whether we have people from Indonesia in the participants. I'm sure they're going to kill me if I say that. They're generally not open to sharing their data. We partnered with the ComInfo Ministry, and she is smiling already, so she knows what I'm speaking. So we partnered with the government of Indonesia, the ComInfo Ministry, to help them understand what exactly is the digital maturity looking like in their country. So it basically gives an opportunity to open up the data that they have internally, partner with multiple departments, line ministries, have more systemic approach towards a particular challenge, like really having these SDGs aligned. So if gender is an issue, there are like 10,000 policies related to gender, right? And like 10 line ministries doing women, women, women. But then what's the use if everyone is duplicating their budgets? So, ideally, the IT ministry would only take care of IT things. The gender or the women and child ministry would only take care of, their programs and schemes. We realize that IT is the heart, digital is the heart now. Everyone is looking at targeting public service delivery systems using digital. So how about the idea of partnering with a ministry which is digital, then collaborating with all the other line ministries, looking at the problem from the systemic perspective. And then, so thankfully, Indonesia government opened up to this. And we're like now on the way of, doing some demo projects using the digital maturity assessment that we are doing with the ComInfo Ministry in Indonesia. But then the same exercise we are actually also doing with Thailand. We are doing with Laos. These are a couple of governments that have actually opened up. We are doing it with Pakistan. So, these are certain tools, techniques to really begin, cracking the nut. And once that happens, we are able to, get right into, the problem space where we know that the ministries, not just ministries, in fact, all of us, like all the stakeholders operate in silos, no matter how much ever we try speaking of, integrating, the challenges that we're working on and trying to have more systemic impact and all of that, we come with our own set of restrictions. So once we have the systems in place, like if the digital maturity assessment matures in such a way that you understand where your loopholes are, you are able to then bring all the stakeholders on board. And if the government is on board, I think all the other stakeholders get automatically on board. So I think these are a couple of ideas that we have tried, with the governments across Asia, and they have opened up their doors, not literally opened up the entire data system, but they've opened up their doors. And I think that's the ray of hope.
Thanks so much. I mean, we've got the discussion going now in the chat group with people putting some examples in there, which is great. I mean, I think we just need to have more positive examples of where this worked. Just one follow-up, and anyone who wants to just jump in and answer this. Like, do you think it's there's some sectors that are easier to sort of implement data-driven strategies around policy than others? Like if a government's sort of looking where to start, have you seen more success in a particular sector or another, or do you think it really just depends on kind of the capabilities and will of the government?
I think just to answer that very, very quickly. Yeah, I mean, from our experience, we've seen that, there's a lot of investment in terms of relationship building and trust building in many different sectors if you want to be able to work with them on the use of their data, right? And at the same time, they also face, from their perspective, several constraints such as data privacy laws and others. And so I think the challenge is really, being able to work closely and make sure that we're able to build that relationship where there's trust, and at the same time, there's a belief in the capacity to be able to use that data. In the Philippines, I think because of COVID, we've had several successful experiences as well. in promoting the use of data in the policy space. For example, because of the move to digital finance, where the government is trying to disperse emergency subsidies as fast as it can, but you have a large portion of the population that are not part of financially excluded actually from formal accounts in the country. And so that was a challenge. And so, we partnered with the Department of Social Welfare and Development to understand the experience of those that were receiving government payments via digital finance, given that most of these people would be opening these digital finance accounts for the first time. But I think that came at a time where it wasn't an exactly a very quick process, because that also required several years of experience in partnership building with government in order to be able to work with them on that. And right now, actually, as Afreen was saying, we're working with UNDP in the Philippines to work with the private sector with digital financial services to be able to access their data. And UNDP and IPA are working very closely to understand, what's the experience of these, low-income households in terms of using this cash payments and making sure that this opportunity to be part of the digital space can continue on and can be sustainable.
Thanks so much. Go ahead. Oh, two people. Who wants to go first?
Yeah,
Priyanka.
No, why don't you? Okay, I'll go for. Yeah, thanks. I think it's a very important question. I do feel that there are some sectors which are more conducive for data to be driving innovation, and the benefits that we can sort of reap out of those sectors may be higher. There could be a couple of reasons for this. One is it depends on the sensitivities around the kind of data, right? So there are certain sectors which oftentimes governments are more sensitive towards, whereas some where data is not so sensitive. There are also, on the other side, there is also the benefit to the public, right? So for example, a sector like health, where we have seen a number of innovations come into place, fortunately or unfortunately due to COVID, in the last 1.5 years is where we have seen sort of the health innovations take place. And also we've seen sort of the public-private partnerships come into place. For one example for that would be a facility that the National Health Authority in India has set up, and which we have partly supported from the Rockefeller Foundation. This is Samrid, which is a blended finance facility to improve and strengthen health infrastructure and sort of provider capabilities, right? So that's one example. I also feel like apart from health, the energy or environment sector is one sector that can benefit heavily from data-driven approaches, which so far we haven't been able to get the benefits to the extent that we should. And with the COP26 dialogues coming up next week, this is certainly an area that could be looked into. What Nasrina mentioned around sort of financial inclusion, and as well as looking at Gaurav's chat in the chat box, looking at civic data labs work in India, for example, through the Open Budget Initiative, right? I do feel that the finance sector is another one that can benefit heavily from data-driven approaches. So thanks. Shreya, over to you.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think it's much, you see variation along the type of data than the sector almost, I would say. So I think governments are much more forthcoming about publishing budget data than they are about expenditure or performance data. It's, in this region, we've seen it be very difficult to get traction around disclosing beneficial ownership of companies, for example, again, politically sensitive data, as Priyanka was mentioning. Or if you look at contracting, you see the tender data coming out quickly. But then again, when you're looking at contract performance and awarding data, progress on those lines is very, very slow. And which is why I think, for us in this community, it's important that while we keep working with governments alongside them, advocating, to them to invest in proactive data disclosure initiatives, we also need to be keeping our eye on the legal frameworks for, that ensure right to information for citizens, which again, in this region, we know there's quite a variation in the number of countries that have the legal provisions, and then those are implemented. So that even if that data is not, being offered and not being used by government, that citizens still have the ability and the legal rights to be able to access that information.
Great, thank you so much. I've been told we need to move on to the next question, which does help address some of the issues we've been talking about in terms of obstacles. So staying of obstacles. Priyanka and Nazreen answering the priority questions that we have before us, and how can we overcome these obstacles? So feel free again to use some specific examples in relation to countries or particular issues. Priyanka, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Anthea. And this is definitely a tough one, but I'll try and put on my data and tech hat rather than the governance side, and then talk from some of my previous experience when I was leading the water program at University of Chicago in India, and working with likes of sort of looking at the work of the Jal Shakti Ministry, etc. in India, and looking at river water pollution data and trying to put real-time data onto an open platform, and then also encouraging the relevant government authorities to do similar stuff to be able to get insights to the public through transparent medium. And what I experience from there says is what I would like to extrapolate to other domains also, where the kinds of obstacles that stand in the way of data answering the priority questions, right, are sort of, first is the question of data availability. Which then, if the right kind of data is available, then leads to the question of data accessibility. And then the question of the quality of data. But above all of this stands the questions around sort of, can the data be trusted? So who owns the data? Who is the data collector? Is sort of the government monitoring itself? And are there sort of enough checks and balances put in place to ensure the transparency, accountability, balance, right? So in all of this, and the other important point which Nasrina had mentioned at the very start was around looking at reliable as well as timely data. So if the data is too outdated, then again, it's of no point in being able to derive insights and analysis out of it, right? So I feel all these points are important, but all of this will be sustained in a fashion where we ensure sort of an enabling policy ecosystem is available to engage with data, right? So the example that was earlier discussed was the RTI, the Right to Information Act example from India. And just staying with that example, I feel like while that one act allows people to be able to get information from the public authorities, it's also a few things that are put in place that help it get to the right place, right? So for example, first thing is that the process is very simple. So you ensure that citizens are able to engage with them. Things like these will also require sort of, if it's available in multi languages. So in a country like India, where everyone may not be sort of well versed with a particular language, it's important to give them the opportunity to engage in forms that are more accessible. So these are ways in which we're making things more accessible to the people. An example of what the Indian Ministry of Electronics and IT has been doing for a while, and they're constantly improving upon this, is the Open Government Data Platform, or OGD, that they have, where they collate some of the data sets from different government departments and ministries and put out in the public domain. Is that sort of the best solution? Is that the most appropriate one? Maybe not, it's getting there, right? So they've changed from sort of just uploading PDFs and data, which is not very analytics friendly, to now looking at APIs or data sets that can directly feed into some of the other work, right? So then there are changes that are being tackled at the government level, and there are innovations that are being tried out from that perspective.
And just to add to what Priyanka was saying, I think those points are extremely relevant. In order to answer the priority questions, it's really a matter of having high quality usable data, or are we going to generate this data if it's not available, right? We've seen such large amounts of data already being collected, and I think everyone is aware of this. But little is being shared, analyzed, or used for research to improve decision-making of policymakers in governance, right? And so, from our perspective, it's important to share data and collaborate with implementing organizations and government agencies for data use. But as Priyank highlighted, access to data remains a challenge in most countries. And we've seen that also in the Philippines, in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, in most of the countries that we work in. And there is a need to develop at the agency level or maybe cross-agency level some sort of data governance guidelines, right? I know this has also been discussed, and I think this is related to what Priyank was saying about having a good ecosystem as well. You know, having these guidelines about data security, right, storage, access rights, having an infrastructure such as a data use agreement template. This has always been a challenge for us working with various agencies, where for each government agency that we work with, we come up with new data use agreements or data access or non-disclosure agreements and all these things. So is there an infrastructure that we can build where this is sort of standardized across different agencies, and then set the criteria for screening uses and users of data? I think that's also the main constraint from the end of government, right? Like they don't want to just publish data, and some of these data are very sensitive and for other people to use it for different purposes, not necessarily for the public good. And we work with very sensitive data, with the judiciary, with the executive branch of government, and that has always been a major concern. So I think it's very important to be able to set that criteria, or who should be the users and what should be the uses of the data that they have, as well as having a secure repository to be able to store data that can make it for legitimate uses of admin data, right? And harder for those who would like to misuse the data. And at the same time, we've also seen, as I mentioned, the capacity for analyzing data is somewhat limited, specifically for data use in improving operational management of government programs, and as well as, using data for learning, which I think is a very important priority, learning from experiences to improve future work. That's why you collect monitoring data, for example. And it's important to prioritize what data we collect, because I think because of all of the data that's being collected, people just end up being overwhelmed in terms of what should be analyzed, what should be, used. And I think that's why the 100 questions is also quite important, because it's a prioritization. It is very relevant, so that we don't end up getting overwhelmed. We end up actually targeting our resources and making sure that we answer what is important, right? And making sure that the data that we have is available for decision making and for learning and improvement. And so it's not just about having credible data, but also making sure that we have the credible analysis for the data that we have.
Yeah, a really good point. And I think it points to the need for bilinguals, like yourselves, kind of across the board, top to bottom, at all levels of society, people who are not data shy, but can kind of in whatever area they work, navigate, analyze, and make data accessible and usable for their constituencies. So yeah, great points. I know it was a tough question. Okay, finally, and we have a lightning round here before we go to our audience questions, and we have a few lined up. So if you could answer one question from the priority questions on governance, there are 10, which one would it be? And how would you operationalize and answer it with data and technology? It's not a 2-minute solution, but you have to give us a 2-minute answer, I'm afraid, on those. So why don't I start with Shreya?
Again, not easy. I think the one I find, personally very interesting is around the correlation between democratic regression and public service delivery. Because again, I think in this region, sometimes, these things are presented as trade-offs, effective public service delivery against sort of, democratic, open, messier processes. The operationalization, of course, is going to be much harder because, especially in decentralized or federal systems, service delivery is handled at the local level. A lot of the erosion, the policies that are linked to the erosion is being enacted at the national or at the federal level. So it might be interesting to look at the local government level and look at correlations between a comparative study looking at localities that have elections at the local level, opportunities for public participation, grievance redressal. Compare that with localities or local governments that don't. See that alongside budgetary allocation expense data. But also citizen satisfaction survey data that's being collected across a number of countries in the region right now, and see what that throws up. Operationalizing this is much more complicated than 2 minutes will allow for. But I think this could be a potentially, again, interesting question for the region as we take on sort of some of these narratives you hear about, you need a certain degree of, the China model, if you will, to get, effective public service delivery going with that, growth and poverty reduction going. So I think just personally, I'd be very interested in seeing what the answers throw up there.
Yeah, great example. Priyank?
Yeah, I think the question around sort of if citizens get more access to data and information, does that sort of automatically mobilize them to take action and engage politically, right? Or sort of under what circumstances would that happen? That's something that is quite interesting to me. And I think the obvious answer for me is sort of no, that's sort of definitely a basic precondition, but there are a number of other factors that need to be thought through. And again, operationalizing this in a couple of minutes is difficult, but I think some of the initial thoughts and reactions that I have are sort of being able to see what is the cost for the citizens to engage with that data, right? As well as sort of what is the opportunity cost? Is it again like a simple form to be filled in trying to access data and then demand action from the relevant authorities towards looking at the data, as well as then looking at sort of other important factors such as data literacy for like the average person, while also trying to be mindful that data is very political, right? So the story that one tells from data could be very different when the data is represented, right? So do you sort of give out just the data in the raw form, or which could again be very difficult for the citizens to sort of analyze it by themselves, and it could be sort of duplication of work, or do you sort of present insights from that, which could then put a layer of bias on it, right? So it's sort of the chicken and egg problem, but one needs to be able to possibly do both and then leave it to the citizens to see if they would like to engage with one or the other form. And then going back to my earlier points, I think the enabling ecosystem and putting the safety nets in place for citizens to engage, simple things like privacy preserving mode of engagement, right? So if one is sort of trying to seek information, if one is trying to act upon that information, then and if the person does not need to reveal their identity because of security safety issues, then that's something that the government of the day should definitely be willing to put in place. So those are some of the things that could help.
Yeah, thank you. Really important about the safety nets. Nasrina.
Thank you. I agree with Shreya that it's very challenging to choose from all of these questions, and I think most of the questions are actually quite interrelated as well. So you sort of like move from one question to another, and they're sort of very much related. But I think one of the things that I find very interesting is really on the question on which populations or groups are not represented in data being collected and the use for formal government decision making, who is at most at risk of being excluded from consideration or inclusion with the rise in data. And I think this is related as well to the questions on trust, on transparency, and others. And I think the reason why this question is extremely interesting to me is really that that it's really important that high quality data and ensuring that data is being collected from populations that are sometimes beyond the reach of social programs. We've encountered many populations, many communities. I'm sure all of you have already done so as well, where the ultra poor, for example, who are at risk of being highly excluded from some of these programs and services. They usually live in hard to reach areas, maybe not easily accessible to governments, even local governments, and may also be most likely at the end of the digital divide. And so the reason why this is important is because it has implications as well on targeting the poor, for example, on social protection programs, other anti-poverty programs, development programs, to ensure that resources are directed at those who need it the most. And that's related to investments in health and education for those who are left behind. And so I think it's important to be very conscious of the data that we collect, looking at sampling, ensuring representativeness, use of data at the local government level. We've seen a lot of data at the village level sometimes that don't get passed along through the hierarchy of government. And because that's most of the data may be paper-based, right? And so there's a process of digitization that's needed. And so I think that's very important to look into these different kinds of data, making sure that, as much as possible, we can digitize the data that's being collected, make sure that's in a format that is usable as well. And because we've also seen that. I also use innovations in data collection and targeting the poor, such as GIS, using spatial statistics to target poverty, for example, and improve programs for the poor as well.
Thanks so much, Nazreen. You're so right. There's so many sort of non-citizens or stateless people across our region, and it's really important to try to include them in any of these processes. Thanks for that. Afreen.
I'd actually like to choose the question which so far I think has got the maximum votes on 100 questions. Basically, what are the key factors contributing to effective civic engagement at national and local levels? It's like, how do we incentivize citizens? So I can actually give you this example of MyGov platform in India that the government has initiated. Gives all the kind of incentives and engaging atmosphere for the citizens to engage with, be it just beginning from writing slogans for some policies, for some schemes, to make feel people to give that feel of belongingness, that the policy belongs to you, it is for you, so you decide what the name of the policy would look like. And then going for public referendums where the policies are kept open. So there's always this thing has been there that initially within, at least for this region, I can share. The governments used to, hold some consultative workshops when they used to draft policies, and then, certain section of the societies used to be invited, and then, CSOs, which were like leading with the government relationships, were invited in the closed door. Policies were drafted, draft 1, draft 2. Cabinet approvals and parliamentary approvals, and gone. So the citizens are not even aware of, what happened. And then now, looking at that and looking at now, there's such a major transformation. So they're like rounds and rounds of consultations, be it provincially, locally, and then nationally. And then after that, it actually is put up on, public domain for comments, and then again, redrafting. So this kind of engagement really is something that does not just account to winning the trust of the citizens. So it of course increases the government citizen trust. That is like there used to be a huge gap. But it also has a very qualitative impact on the programs that are coming out of these policies. So, the policies are very large level. You just can't see a very microscopic view of what is an effect of a policy on a local government, or any resolution that a particular village panchayat is passing, in their villages. But then when the citizens' feedback is accounted for, it automatically starts, giving the larger feedback to the larger policy ecosystem. Somehow I feel that there are countries which are actually doing it, but I feel that having more active citizen engagement, there definitely should be a budgetary provision. Like, I'm just going beyond the region. I'm actually speaking about governments like UAE, who are like really going out of the way in getting their citizen engagement. And then, some really cool ministries coming out of their, the suggestions of the citizens. So Ministry of Possibilities in UAE, or Ministry of Loneliness in Japan, or Ministry of Happiness. So, these are ideas coming out when the governments are interacting more with their citizens, and the citizens are also interacting equally with their governments. These ideas wouldn't come out of ministers alone, or wouldn't come out of the academia alone. It is citizen driven. So I feel that our region needs more of innovation when it comes to citizen engagement. It is there. I think there are mechanisms, but we really need to go more innovative, in engaging. And I would like to end by saying, citizen engagement is not just a tick in the checkbox. It actually should be in, in letter and spirit, which I think our region somehow lacks. So that is one way we probably need to, work a bit better.
Yeah, great final point. Thank you. Very interesting that you all chose different questions. So wasn't planned. So thank you for that. So we are about right on time. We've got a number of questions. I noticed some of you have been answering them in the chat box, but I'm going to go back to one of the first questions, and this comes from Dika Handule. How can we influence the government to adopt suggested alternative policies in respect to non-communicable diseases? I think we only have time for like one person to answer each of these questions. So who would like to take that one? Any NCD people here? No? Okay. Okay, think about it. I'll go on to a next one. I'm sorry, Dika. Okay, there's a question from Yulani on how social media affects political debate. This brings up the issue of dis or misinformation. Social media companies are slow and ineffective at handling disinformation in Asia, as there are many resource-poor languages. Instead of having restrictive laws and blanket social media bans, can governments be encouraged to collaborate with social media companies to build better language resources? How can answering this question help governments to work with social media companies to combat disinformation? Tough one. Taker?
I think I can take that one.
Go for it.
So, you know, these days, social media is actually deciding everything. Like, they decide who wins the elections. They decide which ministry is actually performing better. They decide which ministers are more engaging and inclusive in their politics. And imagine if I am not someone who's digitally connected, I'm a bad person, as in I'm a bad politician if I'm a politician. If I'm not sharing, you know, my initiatives on social media, I'm actually not doing anything. So it is as good as that. So it's like literally become the new normal. It's become essential. At the same time, it is very evasive. You know, I mean, platforms are being misused to create, you know, wave of agenda. So somehow I feel that governments in the region should be more diligent when it comes to the use of social media. But obviously, there is something called as freedom of speech as well for people. So it is you are living in a democratic country. You are free to speak. You have a free will, you know, to engage, have an opinion about things. But at the same time, there should be policies, and there are, I mean, the governments have begun to do that. But there should be policies that address very critical elements of social media. I can tell you with my experience when I used to work with the Election Commission of India in 2014, they were still figuring out ways in which they can draft the policies on social media. And today in 2021, they have like entire manual handbook and I don't know what not, you know, out there to address the challenges on social media. So, I mean, for India, I can give you an example on, you know, how Twitter has been used, misused, you know, how people are really putting WhatsApp on a spot on, you know, chasing their privacy concerns. So a lot of these things come out and the citizens' concern come out, as well as the trends of the decisions of people come out, because there is lack of proper regulation. It's either very authoritarian or it is very loose. So it just can't be these two extremes, right? It has to be somewhere in between, where it's more citizen-centric, where it gets better for the governments to understand, you know, what the perspectives of citizens are. So somehow I feel there is definitely, you know, this is a challenge, and this is also a challenge that we want to address on the Data for Policy platform, that how governments can use the data better, as well as citizens can use the data better that is emerging out of social media. It gives out huge amount of data, but at the same time, you can't trust, right? Because there are bots, there are fake accounts and whatnot. So exactly the reason why we need to regulate the use of social media and make it more ethical. So I don't know whether I've managed to, you know, answer the question there though.
Anthea, can I come in on this one as well? I know you said one per. I think
no, because it relates to another question here, if you can see in the chat from Tanzim Ahmed as well. So maybe you can tackle that one together, Shreya. And that's just about how social media is affecting and shaping democracy, digital divide, public consent, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the answers. I mean, the answer to the question in some sense already, right? I mean, we know that that's happening. I think going back to the previous question, it obviously does not hurt to invest in better language capability, better language resources, right? So for example, at the the height of the second wave in India, there was a collaborative of global scientists and public health officials that collaborated to put out language, different language resources on managing COVID-19, and a lot of try to bust a lot of the myths that were spreading about the disease and its scare, and that was hugely helpful for a lot of people, right? That said, I think when the intention is to disinform or misinform, and when that intention can be traced back to governments themselves, as they can be in many of the countries in this region, then I'm not sure that the language capability is going to necessarily address that issue. So I think obviously this is not just another whole webinar. This is sort of the public policy debate for the next 10 years, possibly, in the way in which things are shaping up. But I'd be careful about looking at this as a purely government regulation versus private sector regulating itself kind of issue. I think this is where sort of civil society, independent oversight also needs to play a role, especially because we know that there are governments in this region and elsewhere. Again, this region is not an exception to this, that use social media to their advantage for the explicit. So I think it's a bit tricky, especially in a global trend of declining civic space, of active disinformation campaigns being launched by political parties and governments, to place all that power in government regulation in getting us out of this sort of age of disinformation.
Thank you. I'm going to have to wrap it up because we're almost at 5 minutes, and I want everyone to have a chance to vote who's online. And I would also like to turn it over to Nicola to tell us, what happens next. Why is it important that we all vote, Nicola, and where do we go from here?
Okay, sorry, I'll get there, hang on. Okay, I think I'm up. So thanks, Anthea. Look, just enormous thanks also to our panelists. I've been so enjoying listening to all of your observations and comments, and also all of the things that have been going on in the chat. So as I said at the beginning, we're 4 stages into a 6-stage process that we're hoping to continue into, and this is the hard part. This is where we need your help. So the final 2 steps take us beyond the original initiative into actioning these questions, answering them with data so that they can be acted upon locally, regionally, or globally. So matching the questions with the data available to answer them, to which you've all been speaking in your responses to the various questions. That's the sort of thing we want to do, to build partnerships, to take forward research, analysis, and policy influence ultimately, and take that forward. So GovLab has pioneered the idea of a data collaborative as a vehicle to do this, and data collaboratives are a form of public-private partnerships in which data also held by private sector entities is leveraged in a responsible and ethical manner to provide public value. And as we all know, there's an enormous amount of data wealth, if you like, that resides in the private sector, in addition to all of the discussion that we've been having about either publicly available data or data that's generated by governments. And we're interested in all different sources of data. So taking this forward, in Bangladesh and Indonesia, our partners are hosting discussions with a range of different public and private stakeholders to respond to questions that make sense in each of those contexts. And one of the things that does happen in these later stages is that we look at how to contextualize some of these questions. At the moment, they're a little decontextualized. They're sort of universal questions. But we know that ultimately not only do we have to start with problems, not solutions, but we also need to start with the local context. So we'll look at building on the work that GovLab has done in the migration domain in particular, which has resulted in the Big Data for Migration Alliance. Under that alliance, they've set up studios that bring together data holders, intermediaries, and demand-side actors to collaborate in contextualizing the questions, as I said, and using data to analyze them. Now, we'd like to initiate the same kinds of forums, particularly by bringing in data holders and government partners, but we'll need your help and the help of many others. These kinds of collaborations require broad partnerships. So if you're interested in answering a particular question or group of questions, if you're inspired by the methodology or find yourself interested in whatever comes out as the top questions after the public vote, or more importantly, if you have ideas of how to contextualize and answer some of these questions with data, please let us know and get involved. So that's it from me. Thank you. Back over to you, Anthea.
Thank you, Nicola. So I think everyone knows what they have to do next. Priority is to vote. But thank you so much to all our panelists for your time and commitment to this process. It's really great to know that there are such dedicated people and passionate champions that are working on this agenda from across the region and in fact across the world. And I was particularly bolstered by comments you made today by the numerous innovative and practical examples that you shared about operationalizing the questions, about how we can take the challenges and things that are actually happening to act on them. And I hope we can share those more widely. And thanks also to our audience for your great questions. I'm really sorry that we didn't have the time to get to them all, but we have recorded the session and it will be available for others to watch. So please do share the link. I think it was such a rich discussion, and I hope that others are able to glean the experiences of our panelists and the examples they shared, and we can share it more widely. And there is the transcript, of course. So finally, thanks to our Asia Foundation team, Nicola, Peter, and Miranda, for all the work in preparing this, looping me in. It was a real pleasure for me to engage today, and I really enjoyed the discussion with the panel, and I hope we get more opportunities to share again. So thanks, and good day, and good evening to everyone.